We'll start now. Welcome to the Jackson Hole China Forum. Today we have a very special group of former senior diplomats who have served this country in a variety of capacities. One thing in common among them is that Mark. we have a reserved seat for you. They all have served in Hong Kong, which is a very, very remote post. People never even thought about there's a place called Hong Kong. But now it's a place in turmoil. These people have served this country so well. First of all, please join me to thank them for the service to the country. Because especially in this kind of political environment, the State Department and for those who have served this country have not been very well respected in the last couple of years. So we really should give our thanks to those people who have served the country. We have a very special person today from the school who will represent the school to express our thanks to the group and also to welcome this crowd to our event. Professor Rachel Epstein is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and also for Faculty Affairs. So she will represent the school to make some remarks. Thank you.
And I want to extend a very warm welcome on behalf of the Korbel School and also on behalf of the Center for Chinese-U.S. Cooperation, which my esteemed colleague, Professor Xiao, runs. And I'm very grateful to all of you for being here. In addition, I just want to say something briefly about how extraordinary it is to have 4 former American consuls general who were all positioned in Hong Kong here in the same room at the same time. I want to give credit to Aaron McKay and also Sam Xiao for organizing it. It's an extraordinary moment for us, an extraordinary opportunity to be able to engage these 4 long experienced people with Hong Kong and Chinese politics, to have them here at Korbel and to be able to listen to their presentations and also after ask questions about their experiences and insight. I'm thrilled to be here. So just by way of introduction, I just want to mention one thing before I hand it back over to Sam, and that is that we are on the eve of the 30th anniversary of the breaching of the Berlin Wall. And exactly 30 years ago today were the Alexanderplatz demonstrations and protests in eastern Berlin, which was part of the social turmoil, which really forced the government's hand and ultimately led to the decision later in the week to let the Berlin Wall open. And I mention it because this was, of course, preceded by many decades, in some cases, of very intense social protest in Eastern Europe in places like Gdansk, Leipzig, Budapest, Prague, right? And the other parallel that I would point out in this circumstance is that in that circumstance too, that is both then and now, there was a large, looming, and decisive force in the politics of protest. In that case, the Soviet Union. For some people, it was already obvious in 1989 that the Soviet Union was crumbling from within and was prepared to let go of its satellites in the Eastern Bloc. What I do not detect in today's situation is a similar kind of decay in China. And so when we think about the consequences of protest in a place like Hong Kong, and whether popular uprisings in that part of the world were anything like the apocalyptic effect that they did in 1989, it's a big question. And I do wonder, I mentioned briefly to some of our speakers beforehand about how impressive it is, in a way, the tenacity and endurance of the protesters, which also reminds me of the situation in Eastern Europe. But I do wonder whether we can expect anything like a similar kind of transformation given the larger political context in which China plays such a central role. So I'm thrilled to have you all here, and I very much look forward to your presentations and the discussion. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. for Professor Epstein, who has representing the school to welcome the group and also welcome you all. We are very, very fortunate to have Professor Epstein to be a strong supporter to the China Center to our events. Now we will start our program. We have a former consuls journal. The way we go is that we give each of them 5 minutes. If you go more than 5 minutes, I will stop you. They can go for 7 minutes, but I will try to maintain the flow of the conversation. We'll start from the Consul Journal in 1990s, then we go all the way from the one just came back from Hong Kong this year. In fact, if you read news, when he left Hong Kong, he gave a speech which had a big spread. I remember at that time in what club that, so we go 1990s, then to the 21st century. And let me give a brief introduction to each of them. When I do the introduction, I go from the most recent, Ambassador Tong. He's now currently a partner at the Asia Group. And he served the State Department for many years, had a number of functions. One of his roles was ambassador for the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. He also worked at the White House and posted to many places in Asia, in Seoul, Beijing, Tokyo, Manila, all those places. Then the next to Ambassador Tong, Ambassador Stephen Yang. He retired from State Department in 2013, but he served 33 years in the State Department as a foreign service officer. He has posted in many other places, and he was a U.S. ambassador to Kyrgyz Republic, Kyrgyzstan Republic, and but for many people in this room, also in Asia, he was known as the Direct General, or U.S. De facto ambassador to Taiwan, which I think is a very important position he has had. And then we have Ambassador Richard Boucher. He is also senior diplomat for many years. Among his 32-year service in the State Department, he was Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. He also ambassador to which country? Richard? Cyprus, okay. And then we have Richard Miner. He also served in the State Department for 32 years. And in a variety of positions. We are really happy that he's a local now. And in fact, I want to thank him for helping putting this panel together. And he was a Consul General in Hong Kong in 1990s and retired there and moved around, finally now settled in Hong Kong. So now we will start. Richard, you have 5 minutes. He said he wants to have 10 minutes, so give him 8 minutes. You want to go to the podium?
Please.
Yes,
Please.
please.
Yes.
Please. Hello. You say please. They want to see who you are, so you got to stand up. Okay.
Let's see whether this one works. No? Hello?
It takes a few seconds before.
Here we go. Great. Well, thank you, Professor Zhao, for that very nice introduction. Thank all of you for coming. And I have to say to Sam, remember we negotiated last night I could have 10 minutes? Because we need to set the stage first, right? Since I'm the old guy here, first going. Anyway, we decided to go in order, and I would take some time to set the stage a bit. Looking back in history, what were some of the high points and low points of the last several decades in Hong Kong? And then some of the things that we in fact did and experienced in Hong Kong during our time while we were there. So if you get tired of me, Sam, Just give me the hook. Okay. I want to go back to 1898. I'm curious whether anybody remembers Sir Claude Maxwell MacDonald. Does that name ring a bell with anybody? See, Sam, this is why we have to go back in history. He was the British minister to China who negotiated the Second Convention of Peking. And among other things, he agreed on a 99-year lease for Hong Kong, for a part of Hong Kong that was subsequently called, and still called, the New Territories. Well, you look back again and you wonder why he said 99 years. And he said, well, 99 years is as good as forever. Think about it, as good as forever. And in some ways, I guess that's true, but didn't make Margaret Thatcher any happier as she did the negotiations, didn't make Prince Charles any happier at the handover ceremony. But you have to remember that in 1898, I believe, was a beginning or a continuation of significant difference on both sides of the border between Hong Kong and China. And I think as we think about Hong Kong and China, make a note that the differences on each side of the border are really, really important. Everything from language to principles and values, local histories, cultures, and so forth. It's one of the reasons Deng Xiaoping was as willing to engage in negotiations with Britain to keep Hong Kong going in a good direction, as he knew that you could not suddenly bring Hong Kong into China and hope everything would go well. I think the place would have emptied out very, very quickly. So keep in mind the differences on both sides of the border. Claire and I served at the U.S. Liaison Office in Beijing, 1976 to 1978, and we used to go to Hong Kong regularly. And for those of you who know Hong Kong and China, the cultures on the two sides of the border are rather extraordinarily different. And we saw that every time we went in both directions. So here we are with turmoil in Hong Kong, going back many, many decades. One of the questions that I kept getting, and I know my colleagues really got over the years, was what's going to happen in Hong Kong after 1997? Sometimes I wanted to say, I don't have the slightest idea. Why don't you go ask somebody else? But usually we would say, well, if China continues to open up, if China is less controlling, then prospects are pretty bright for Hong Kong. Today, one of the things I like us to keep in mind is really the need to understand not only the differences, but the need for very careful words and actions on both sides of the border. So much is at stake, really. And my bottom line today is what's going to happen in the future really depends a lot on China and on Hong Kong. I would probably say if the two sides treat each other as adults with respect, some softer words, some willingness to listen, a willingness to say out loud, we've got 22 years experience at this point with one country, two systems. Let's see whether we can sit down and see where we need to make some changes. I think China bears the greatest responsibility for trying to reach out, build more bridges, because they're the ones who hold the ultimate power. And frankly, there is so much at stake, not only for China, but for Hong Kong and I think the rest of the world also. Let me give you a few thoughts about my own experiences and some of the things that happened both before and after I was there that we ought to keep in mind. In 1982, Margaret Thatcher went to Beijing. She began the negotiations with Deng Xiaoping. Maybe it's not very nice to point out, but Hong Kong will still remember that she stumbled down the steps of the Great Hall of the People. A lot of people in Hong Kong actually said that was a very bad omen for Hong Kong because she stumbled. But it became very clear then the negotiations weren't going anywhere. By 1983, Claire and I had just arrived in Hong Kong. I was in charge of the economic section. And interestingly, all of a sudden the bottom dropped out of the Hong Kong dollar. Store shelves were emptied of food. There was true panic. Something I never thought I would really see in Hong Kong. But there was that much attention to the negotiations, which weren't going anywhere, that it led to this panic, and then ultimately linking the US dollar, the Hong Kong dollar, to the US dollar at 7.8, which is still the linked rate today. Well, that actually provided some jet fuel to both China and to Hong Kong to put the negotiations into high gear, see what they might be able to come up with. And then in 1984, the famous Sino-British Joint Declaration, which later became the basic law of China, enshrined in its constitution, was announced. And in many ways, it was a rather extraordinary document, and still is to this day. China was willing to allow Hong Kong for 50 years to continue to basically have its current way of life, rule of law, freedoms, and so forth. And I think up to a point, it reassured people that there was some goodwill on both sides. From China's perspective, they also looked across the Pearl River to Macau. They wanted to bring Macau back, which they did in 1999. And they also looked to Taiwan to bring Taiwan back as part of one country, two systems. Taiwan's not interested yet. Steve, who spent a lot of time here, I'm sure can address that more. So fast forward to June 4th, 1989, the famous Tiananmen massacre and everything that happened. It was a real experience for Hong Kongers as well as for the rest of us. And certainly it got Hong Kong focused on the fact that China really is different. Their governmental system is very different. And it began to get Hong Kongers to suggest they needed to find safe havens, not only for their money, but for their families. I've never forgotten that the business people who put their families overseas would fly back and forth, and they were known as astronauts. And in Chinese, the phrase was "tai kong ren," which meant an astronaut, or the place of the wife is empty. It was a good Chinese pun. So if you fast forward, so the next 3 years were difficult years, or several years were difficult years in China as well as in Hong Kong. But if you fast forward to 1992, the United States, the Congress passed the Hong Kong Policy Act. And if you're interested in Hong Kong and US politics, you ought to give it a read, because it provides strong support for Hong Kong, and China for that matter, for us to respect the one country, two systems approach, and to support Hong Kong's continued way of life, rule of law, and so forth. But it's also important to note that should Hong Kong no longer be autonomous, as China had promised, then the president can begin to take steps to change or terminate the U.S. relationship. Fast forward to early 90s, when I got to Hong Kong as Consul General. It was interesting. In the previous year, Deng Xiaoping had gone down to Shenzhen, which is the special economic zone right across the border. And among other things, he wrote, "Shenzhen hao," Shenzhen is good. And that was a signal for reform, economic reform, to pick up again in China. And it was actually a good signal for the people of Hong Kong. They said, yeah, maybe there's something in this new relationship where we will be able to make money, invest in China, etc. So when I was Consul General, just very briefly, what are some of the things that I did, other things that my colleagues did? Well, as good professional diplomats, we really stayed in touch with all points on the compass. PRC Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, foreigners, Americans, and so on. You learn a lot about the place you're in, you get a sense of what's going on, and then you're trained to connect the dots. It's one of my favorite phrases, connect the dots. What does it mean when you draw the picture? So we spent a lot of time. I had something of a back channel or private relationship with a couple senior PRC people who would come one from Beijing, one lived in Hong Kong, to just have quiet talks about what was going on, what U.S. policy was, and so on. With one of them, I had a very fascinating conversation about how to govern China and what does a federal system possibly mean with China. I won't go into it now, but if we talk about governance of China, think of federalism and how the Chinese respond to it. We spoke up very forcefully in terms of the fundamentals of what made Hong Kong such a special place. We pushed back when people tried to suggest we were interfering in China's internal affairs. And I think all of us during our time there, one time or another, were either called interfering or were black hands in some way behind the scenes. We maintained close relations with Macau, because Macau was planned, it was planned that Macau would go back again in 1999. A brief word about Governor Chris Patton, who was a fascinating character. I got to know him, and I do give him a lot of credit for wanting to do the right thing for Hong Kong. He believed in the principles, most of which were in the Joint Declaration, rule of law and freedoms and autonomy and so forth. He pushed the envelope, trying to put in place a political system which Britain itself had never wanted to put in. And so, of course, he was criticized by Beijing and others for pushing the envelope. So if you fast forward then to the handover, and I'm intruding a little bit on my friend Richard Boucher, I stepped down in 1996, handed the reins to Richard, but stayed on as director of the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, and was invited, therefore, to attend all of the handover ceremonies. It was a great political victory for China, obviously. It was not so great for Britain. We sat, Claire and I, who was here, we sat outside at the British ceremonies in the drenching rain. It had rained for day after day after day. And Hong Kongers, being superstitious, of course, said, well, bad omen, the rains keep coming. That's not good for the future of Hong Kong. So we sat there with visiting Senator Murkowski and his wife. We wore our Hong Kong handover ties, which I wore in honor of today. Our 1997 themed umbrellas. Hong Kongers will make a buck wherever they can, so maybe a handover, but that's okay. So we sat outside, we listened to Prince Charles, drenched in the rain, and thought, you know, the jewel in the crown is about to be handed over. So that night in the convention center, it really was a very solemn, not a fun ceremony at all. So at one point, a friend of mine and I went out on the balcony to look at the city, and we looked at the Royal Yacht Britannia waiting there at HMS Tamar to take Prince Charles and the governor outside of Hong Kong territorial waters by midnight of that night. And we found there were two Chinese chefs who were there. They were taking a rest. And we asked them what they thought. And one of them answered in English, "Old boss go, new boss come. Don't like new boss, I quit." And to me, in some ways, that really encapsulates a lot of what's going on in Hong Kong. So, in conclusion, Hong Kong really remains my favorite city. Claire and I went back again in '05, and I was head of school of Hong Kong International School, and have stayed in touch over the years. Much has changed in Hong Kong, much has not changed. But to me, it retains a unique spirit and a can-do energy, which I felt in my first visit to the city many decades before. So not infrequently, I think of the words of that Hong Kong chef, and I pray that the new boss will be wise, restrained, and understanding as it appreciates the immense value of its new jewel. So I will quit there before Sam pulls me off the stage.
Okay, so you have 10 minutes. You did what we talked about. You talk about personal experiences. That's exactly what we want to have in this event. So, another Richard Boucher.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Professor Zhao, Dr. Epstein for having us here, and all of you for coming. And I think for all of us who believe and love Hong Kong, think of it as a very special place. It's really exciting to see this much interest in the place. I think especially when we were serving in the mainland or even Taiwan in the early days, you know, you come out for a weekend in Hong Kong, it's kind of like dying and going to heaven. It was just and still is a fantastic city, and a really vibrant city. One of the people I worked with, one of the officials there said, nobody ever made money betting against Hong Kong. And I tend to think that's still true, although it's a little harder to emphasize these days than it was in the past. So I'm going to pick up where Richard left off in the rain. It just went on and on and on. And the British friends would say that, you know, the heavens were weeping for our departure. You know, and the Chinese would say, oh, it's the abundance of heaven, new rice crops, and everything will grow. And our driver said, it just makes everything a mess. You can't get around town. So, you know, take your interpretation of the rain as you wish, but the rain eventually stopped, and we started looking at Hong Kong as it was after the handover. And I think, you know, from the U.S. government point of view, from those of us who were on the ground, had been on the ground for a year or two, we weren't looking for dramatic change. You know, we'd gone through the handover with these just wildly exaggerated stories in the U.S. press. You know, Dan Rather was showing tanks coming into central Hong Kong the way they went into Tiananmen Square. There were all these stories about, you know, terrible things that were going to happen on day one. And we had consistently been telling Washington, no, that's not the way it's going to be. And I was talking to Sandy Kristoff at the National Security Council, and she said, but Richard, you know, people aren't reading your cables, they read the Washington Post. So I called up the Washington Post correspondent and said, let's have lunch, and started talking to him. And what we predicted would happen, happened, and that's not a lot. We were in pretty much the same kind of situation as we were before. There was a dramatic attack on the currency in the fall when a bunch of hedge funds, including George Soros and the Tiger Fund and the Quantum Fund, went after the Hong Kong dollar and tried to bring it down, and the financial secretary deployed all the money in the pension funds to stop them. But he bought low and sold high, and now the Hong Kong pensioners have a nice solid fund that pays for their retirement. So, you know, there were things like that that happened. The main drama was actually not in Hong Kong. The main drama was that 2 days after the handover, the Thai baht went through the floor, and we were in the middle of the Asian financial crisis. And again, Hong Kong was the center of the action. And I have to kind of disagree with Professor Zhao that Hong Kong's not a faraway place. It's only 15 hours from JFK on a flight. When you're in Asia, it's the center of the world. And we all felt like that, especially during the Asian financial crisis, because so much of the banking, so much of the investments, so much of the accounting, so much of the legal services that were fueling growth in Hong Kong, fueling growth in Southeast Asia. U.S. company headquarters. A lot of that stuff was going on in Hong Kong, and everybody was trying to deal with it from their Hong Kong offices. So the financial crisis was in some ways the biggest event of 1997, not just the handover. The handover was kind of subtle. And at first, I think the greater involvement of the mainland in Hong Kong was probably positive for most of the people. You had more and more tourists coming. You had stores down in Central, you know, Gucci and Prada and all those people opening up and not selling to Hong Kong people as much as selling to Chinese tourists. Chinese who didn't trust the quality of milk for their kids that was being sold on the mainland would come down to Hong Kong and start buying milk and diapers and things like that, where they could buy a trustworthy product. Chinese companies that wanted to list on a stock exchange, their goal, the kind of mark of status was to list on the Hong Kong exchange, because it was well regulated, it was open, it was free, and you had to meet the strict requirements to list a stock there. So in many ways, Hong Kong was a place that benefited from the initial opening up, from having more and more mainlanders coming in. And what made it important to foreigners, to the American business community and others, the rule of law, the open information environment, the product of regulation, the quality of regulation, all these things were important to the Chinese companies that were coming into, and the Chinese investors. Now, over time, there's been a clear degradation in some of those things, and I think that's where you get to look at, the legal system is still solid, the regulatory system is still solid, even the information environment is still solid, but there are these sort of encroachments around the edges, and I think the people, especially the young people in Hong Kong, they see competition from mainlanders that are often as well or better educated than they are. They see the problems of getting an apartment, they see the problems of sort of making their life, and they start to see that the 50 years that Deng Xiaoping promised one country, two systems for after the handover is almost half gone now, more than half gone now. And so they're starting to look at this and say, what direction is this going? And it's starting to close in on them. And all these things that made Hong Kong open and free and reliable are starting to close in. And I think fundamentally, that's where you get the demonstrations from. One of the things that was promised in the basic law was that there would be eventually universal suffrage for the choice of chief executive. And that became the spark that set off the demonstrators this time, when it became clear that Beijing was going to continue the sort of selection committee process to choose the chief executive, and they were not going to move to real universal suffrage as they saw it. So that brings us from the rain to somewhere in the middle of where we are now, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Well, you put me in an awkward position. I live in New Hampshire, and you got me looking out at your mountains, and I might just drift away and start dreaming. But I'll try to stay on topic. We have some very nice mountains in New Hampshire that are not as tall as yours, but I was hiking in the Sierra Nevada some years ago, and we met some Germans, and we exchanged 10,000 feet. We exchanged pleasantries, and when I said I was in New Hampshire, they said, "Ooh, New Hampshire, you have the mountains in New Hampshire at 4,000 feet. They're like our Alps at 10,000 feet." Because we're rugged mountains, Robert Frost wrote a poem about it, if you want to check that out. They're durable, tough, rugged mountains like the people in New Hampshire, and that's why we're called the Granite State. First of all, it's great to be out here and to see old friends, Richard Mueller. Actually, Richard and I were all on the China desk in the early 1980s, which is a coincidence that we ended up, all of us, having the pleasure of serving in Hong Kong. But I'm going to go back to that because I first saw Hong Kong in 1982 when I was the Hong Kong desk officer on the China desk. I was also a bit player in the UK PRC talks because Maggie Thatcher was engaged with Deng Xiaoping, and the talks were going very badly, and the ambassador, or number 2 from the British Embassy, would come and brief us on the talks, brief my boss, and I'd be in the room and a note taker. And at the end of each briefing, he would say, "Could you please put in a good word with the Chinese for us?" And I think it was State Roy. He'd nod, and the guy would leave, and he'd turn to me and say, "We couldn't possibly have any influence with this, and we'd be foolish to try." But it did show how frustrated the British were with the talks. Maggie Thatcher thought she could extend the lease beyond 1997 for Kowloon and the new territories, but it soon became apparent that Deng Xiaoping had other plans. Hence the face-saving pledge to preserve Hong Kong's unique status for at least 50 years under this concept of one country, two systems. The pledge was also offered to Taiwan, with which I've had a long association starting in the 1960s when my father was a military advisor there, but it has never had resonance. Taiwan has its own military, its effective sovereignty, and 90 miles of the Taiwan Strait separating it from China, as well as the very implicit but strong American commitment to come to their assistance if they are ever threatened by China or anybody else. As an Asianist in the US diplomatic corps, I watched the vicissitudes of Hong Kong as a close observer. At first, Deng appeared intent on lining up with the spirit and the letter of the deal on Hong Kong. After all, it was a vibrant financial and trade center, as Richard have described, playing an outsized role in China's economic boom through the 80s and 90s. And top Chinese leaders recognized that any hope of resolving the Taiwan issue satisfactorily and peacefully hinged on a successful management of the Hong Kong turnover. As Richard, why isn't your name Richard? That would make it easier. Personally observed, the 1997 turnover was tranquil enough. Some Hong Kongers voted with their feet, emigrating to Australia, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other places. But many more sought foreign passports as a hedge and yet continued to live and work in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. Most outside observers saw little benefit in Hong Kong's asserting more muscular presence in Hong Kong after the turnover. But fast forward to Xi Jinping, who took power in 2011, I believe, as the head of the People's Republic. Now he is a Gaogan Zidi, or the son of a high-ranking official, and therefore a princeling. And Xi Jinping showed his ambition early on by purging any political rivals for, I'm shocked at this, corruption. And then he announced his intention a couple of years ago to become the leader for life, rather than to honor the Deng Xiaoping standard of 2 terms, crushing any ambitions of those who would put him in power, that they might be able to take the job following his 2-term limit. I think this is a very vulnerable point for that man right now, and after I've long left admiring your mountains, you can remember that when something happens to Xi Jinping. But more specifically, China stymied the Hong Kong people's aspirations for more of a voice in Hong Kong politics by rigging the selection of Hong Kong leaders to prevent anyone not already sanctioned up north from ever running for the job, much less getting it. The result is the greatest turmoil in a Chinese entity since Tiananmen nearly 30 years ago. I speak of the protests, the ongoing protests in Hong Kong. This is not an abstract matter for the masses of young people in the streets of Hong Kong today. For them, 2047 is their future. Maybe for us in the 1980s, it seemed like it was over the horizon, although I'm beginning to hope that I can live to 2047 now. My wife laughs at me. But for them, 2047 is their future. And meanwhile, the democratic people of Taiwan have drawn the proper conclusion that no promise that the PRC makes is worth the paper it's written on. I think that's particularly clear over the last several months. After nearly 30 years of choosing their own leaders in democratic elections, the 23 million citizens of Taiwan want nothing to do with one country, 2 systems, or any other pledges for closer, peaceful reunification with the mainland. In fact, Mr. Xi should be proud of himself. His thuggish treatment of Hong Kong's modest aspirations has now made President Tsai Ing-wen the odds-on favorite to win next January's presidential election and secure a second term in office. Earlier, she looked like she was in trouble, but now people watching what's going on in Hong Kong want a tough leader who's willing to stand up to PRC. Meanwhile, the pro-reunification politicians in Taiwan are scurrying for cover. Former President Ma Ying-jeou's rapprochement meeting in Singapore with Xi Jinping a few years ago seems like an ancient piece of history. Even the autocratic, admiring President Trump is under pressure to draw back from his bromance with Xi Jinping, I think. Meanwhile, the US Congress has shown strong bipartisan support for Hong Kong and Taiwan, both in legislation and approval of arms packages to the island nation. One has to wonder if Mr. Xi's mishandling of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and US relations could in turn trigger a backlash from those who put him into power just 8 years ago. The best we can hope for is that Mr. Xi or those who keep him in power in China will draw back from the current standoff in Hong Kong and return to the true spirit of the earlier pledges to allow the people in the former colony a great deal of autonomy under the PRC sovereign rule. Or will they keep pushing their current agenda against the clear opposition of the majority of Hong Kong residents and most of the rest of Asia and the world? With the Chinese economy cooling off, you'd think the answer is obvious. Despite, it's tough when you can't read your own writing. Let's step back from the problem and back off the pressure to tighten PRC tentacles on the former policy and have the government there instead focus on addressing the myriad problems that Xi and his inner circle face today. Otherwise, I fear more problems ahead, both for the people of Hong Kong and for their authoritarian ruler to the north. Thank you. I look forward to your questions, and I made it without spending too much time wishing I was up in those mountains.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Sam, thank you very much. Aaron, Virginia, thank you for bringing us out here. Professor Epstein, thanks for having us. I'm going to bring you now up to when I left Hong Kong, which was about 3 months ago, in July of this year. I was actually back in Hong Kong last week. I highly recommend it. I suggest you all go frequently. It's a nice place, still a good place to visit. Better not to arrive at the airport on Sunday if you're worried about postponed flights. But you do get a little reimbursement from the airlines if your flight gets canceled. So if you're a gambler, maybe you actually want to target a Sunday arrival. Sam referenced a speech that I gave when I was leaving Hong Kong. It became a little bit of a deal between me and the Trump administration. So I've published it because I had to deliver it off the record. I published it in something called a very obscure journal called the American Ambassador's Review. So please look it up if you'd like to see a more spelled out dissertation on U.S. Hong Kong affairs. But I think I want to start with picking up from where my esteemed colleagues left off, with just thinking for a second about what is it that the United States in particular sees in Hong Kong. Why do we care, other than the fact that Hong Kong has nice people and is a good place to visit, yummy food, and all of that? And I think that Richard Boucher touched on this quite a bit in emphasizing that the Hong Kong system, the integrity of its common law jurisdiction, the efficiency of the governance, the relative freedom of expression, the ability to do business and maneuver in a place that is part of China but very different from the rest of China, continues to be extraordinarily valuable to the U.S. private sector, and also an opportunity for people in academia, NGOs and the like, to do work in China and with China in a unique way. So it's of value to the United States. It's in all of the other countries of the world outside of China. It's also, people of Hong Kong, of course, value Hong Kong because it's their home. And 6 million of the 7 million people in Hong Kong don't have a second passport. and so they're very dedicated to the city. But from a Chinese perspective, what do they see in Hong Kong? And I think this is an important thing to touch upon. That from the mirror perspective, Hong Kong is a gateway to the international community, particularly in business, but also a reflection of how the rest of the world sees China and an opportunity for Chinese to do business and commerce and also personal interaction with the rest of the world in ways that are less feasible directly. Now that is diminished as a role from the Chinese perspective, and Hong Kong has shrunk as a part of the Chinese economy. From when the handover, Hong Kong represented well over 15% of China's economy. Now it's less than 3%, headed towards 2%, where it'll probably stabilize around that level. But it's not as important to China as it was. And that gets me into the story of the last 3 years that I witnessed. I'll reach a little bit into my predecessor's time. In 2014, there was a lot of discussion in Hong Kong about what do we do about this issue that was mentioned about direct election of the chief executive, allowing everyone to vote. And Beijing proposed a framework that would require 1,200 people to choose 3 candidates. And those 1,200 people are weighted in favor of being pro-Beijing in their orientation, so relatively likely to take the suggestions of the mainland government and who to choose. And that was Beijing's last and final offer. They made that very clear. And instead of taking it, a lot of people in Hong Kong went to the streets, and we saw the umbrella movement in 2014. That movement then led to the Legislative Council to reject that proposal in 2015, and then in 2016 for the democratic forces in Hong Kong to start to gain seats in the Legislative Council. The way that it's gerrymandered, highly gerrymandered in Hong Kong, just like the United States, but in a different way. The seats are organized so that the pro-Beijing people have a structural majority, which is difficult to overcome. But the Democratic folks gained a lot of seats in the 2016 September election, a week after I arrived in town. And there was seemingly momentum for a kind of negotiating kind of situation for the people of Hong Kong versus the Chinese government and thinking about their governance going forward. That fell apart in the subsequent 2 years. It's not my fault, it sort of is. But what happened instead of sincere engagement was the Beijing government increasing its staff, monitoring Hong Kong affairs, and becoming increasingly operational in giving advice and direction to the Hong Kong government on a variety of matters, including political issues. And that led to a gradual buildup of anxiety among the Hong Kong population that the situation was shifting under their feet, and that the stabilization that they had hoped for in the couple of years previously was going back to the gradual diminishment of Hong Kong's autonomy over time that had been experienced for about 10 years. So what's going on in Hong Kong now? A lot of people obviously are very unhappy to the extent that they're willing to get arrested and risk physical injury at demonstrations and the like. And there have been widespread public demonstrations in support of the agenda of the protesters. I would put demonstrators and protesters in a different basket. Maybe we can use a less polite word for them and call them what they are, which is vandals. But there's moral support for their agenda, if not for their violent activities. That comes from, in my opinion, 3 things. The anxiety of Beijing's increasing pressure on the Hong Kong system, which I described. Economic inequality. And a lot of the pro-establishment people in Hong Kong like to say, well, this isn't really about politics, this is about our economy and the fact that it's so difficult cost of living so high. It takes 20 years of savings to buy a house. Not 20 years of savings, actually, 20 years of income. It's 3 times San Francisco. And San Francisco has suburbs. Hong Kong doesn't have suburbs. So basically, people can't buy housing. The Gini curve, for economists in the room, is off the charts. The income distribution is skewed very, very severely, and people feel a lot of economic pressure. The other part of this is identity, and that was touched upon as well. That Hong Kong has a very Cantonese culture, using Cantonese language, traditions, and social norms, which are very different from those on the mainland. And that also leads to friction. And as the tourist population coming to Hong Kong increased from next to zero when second Richard was there, to 50 million a year, which is a lot of people. It's almost as many international visitors as there are come to the United States in a year. We're a little bigger than Hong Kong. It feels very like there's a lot of pressure. And that personal interaction thing got very severe. I'm going over time, Sam, but I'll shut up later and let everyone talk more. So what happened then, there's an extradition bill. Carrie Lam, who's a nice person, who, I think has sincere interests of Hong Kong in mind, but had a skewed understanding of where her people were, introduced a piece of legislation that would allow people in Hong Kong to be extradited to China. That's not a crazy idea. If somebody killed someone in the mainland and went to Hong Kong, you'd want them to go back to the mainland and have a trial, right? Go to jail, maybe get executed. Although you couldn't do that because Hong Kong law would forbid it under the terms of an extradition arrangement. But the point being that it's not a crazy thing, but it was very, very poorly done, and the scope of the law of the crimes which were to be covered under this was much broader than the business community wanted to see. They were worried that they were going to get extorted by people on the mainland, and they'd have to deal with lots of legal cases and the like. So they started fighting this bill. The international business community started fighting the bill. Jerks like me and the foreign diplomatic community started speaking out against it, and then eventually people were like, yeah, we don't want this either, and took to the streets. And throughout that process, the government tried to convince them that it was a good idea rather than adjust their goals. And it led to really an eruption of anxiety in Hong Kong. So the situation now is best characterized as stalemate. The violent protesters are locked in on their strategy. They're feeling very empowered and very committed to their approach. The democratic politicians in Hong Kong are aiming for the November district council elections and not letting up. The government is taking, the business community is taking an approach of trying to just hide and not get caught in the middle of all this. The Hong Kong government, in coordination with the Beijing government, is trying to wait it out and hoping that the protests will die down and it'll just go away and people will get quiet again like they did after the umbrella movement in 2014. And Beijing is locked into a position of neither directly taking charge of the situation by bringing in its own police or something like that, but on the other hand, not allowing the Hong Kong government to have the flexibility to actually reach a meeting of the minds with the protesters on the course forward. So, stalemate. I honestly don't know how long it's going to continue. In my current job, I get asked that about 3 or 4 times a week, and honestly tell them I don't know, but that's a good description of the situation, and there's a possibility that this is a new normal for Hong Kong. And Hong Kong will continue to have political unrest for the foreseeable future, and people will just have to adjust to that, just like they did in the United States to crime in cities in the 1970s and 80s or other kind of inconveniences in life. This is more than an inconvenience, obviously. So what should we all be doing? I think it's important for, as I said, for the Chinese government, Beijing, to just let up, lighten up, and just say, they hinted at it a little bit in the statements coming out of the party plenum last week, but not really. And they also mixed it with messages about the importance of sovereignty and security in Hong Kong and fighting the idea of independent thought in Hong Kong. But what they should do is just say, hey, Hong Kong, you take care of it. It's yours. You guys deal with it, and empower the Hong Kong government to take charge of the situation and address the concerns of the people. The Hong Kong government then in turn should actually sincerely engage with people. I don't think that the current chief executive anymore has a reputation where that would be effective for her to do it herself. but the government writ large could step in and start to talk to people and figure out a way forward together. And people outside of Hong Kong and outside of China, I think, should do the kind of thing that we're doing today by reminding people of China's commitment to a one country, two systems framework, support autonomy both in word but also in action. One of my big frustrations in the first 2 years of my tenure in Hong Kong was a lack of visitors or attention from Washington, and that's not unique to the Trump administration. There's just not, there's a tendency in U.S. politics to only run to when there's a fire, right? Let's be honest. U.S. politicians are a little bit like the lawyers that chase ambulances. And that's what you see, and rather than the steady work to actually build up a relationship and reinforce Hong Kong's autonomy. So with those thoughts, look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you can see how capable American diplomats are. And now we move to the next stage of this program, which is a conversation before we opened up to the audience. So both Professor Epstein and myself will pose some questions to the panelists. Then we have some conversation. Then we open up. First, Professor Epstein will have some questions for them.
So thank you so much for those presentations. When Ambassador Tong was talking just now, he talked about the fact that it would be wise for the government in Beijing to perhaps have a more relaxed attitude towards the protesters and the demonstration, and that it would behoove them to empower the Hong Kong authorities. There seems, though, to be a pattern of overreaction. I'm just thinking about sports heroes in the United States tweeting about support for demonstrators in Hong Kong. Can you give us any insight about the impulse towards that kind of what I perceive to be overreaction, which seems like it would make it quite unlikely that Beijing would take a more hands-off approach? I'm interested in knowing what the sources of what I perceive to be that overreaction to be.
Is that for me or
Yeah.
everybody? I'd be interested in my colleagues' thoughts on it as well. I think that's a good description of the impulse from an outside perspective, that it is overreaction, oversensitivity, and one of the most important things I'm sure all of us did in our job was to say, hey, we're not trying to take Hong Kong away from China. It's yours. You know, let's just be clear. There is no, Berlin Wall here. China is not a fading Soviet Union, and so that's not the idea. The idea is to keep the one country, two systems framework alive. The impulse comes from it's an emotional reaction by people steeped in Chinese Communist Party thinking that why do we allow, and why do these Hong Kong people, why are they so ungrateful? They should want to be Chinese, because we're a great country. And so what are they doing? This is terrible. And then these foreigners stepping in, it's not their place. Why are they yapping about this is their thinking. And so they react to it. There's also, I think, a bit of intentional letting people rip on the Hong Kong issue within China and on social media, because it actually helps protect China from their perspective, infection of democratic and open system ideas into China. So by characterizing the demonstrators as bad people and the foreigners as nasty, interfering, black hand, whatever folks, they reinforce the narrative within China that, boy, isn't it better to just be in the warm bosom of great Communist Party China, and we're taking care of everybody and everyone should be happy. And the fact of the matter is, that actually works to a significant extent within China, and you do see a lot of very sincere outrage on the part of Chinese persons, and we've seen it on university campuses. We haven't had any today. I was kind of disappointed that we don't. But I'm not trying to foster that, and the University of Denver looks like a nice place. But sincere kind of anxiety on the Chinese side as well. So, anyways.
I'll give it to you after I say
Okay.
one thing, which is, I think one of the reasons the Chinese are so worried about this is because much as they want to control information within the PRC itself, I think a lot of information is flowing in about what's going on in Hong Kong, and that's their real worry. Not the 7 million people in Hong Kong, but the, take your pick, 1.4 billion or whatever people in China who are continuing to be denied the kind of freedoms that most of the rest of the world, particularly in Asia, enjoy.
Yeah, I agree with everything everybody said about the mainland, and the sort of the prickliness of the Chinese Communist Party has been evident to all of us for a long time, particularly on things that involve democracy and wanting to use this as a sort of nationalist lesson inside China, lesson that democracy equals chaos, and we don't want that. But I also worry about overreaction in the United States. A lot of the news reports right now remind me of those news reports before the handover, that, you know, everybody's looking for Chinese tanks to come in and Chinese soldiers to march across and Chinese police to show up and start knocking heads. And what is clear from the Chinese side is they want Hong Kongers to take care of the problems in Hong Kong. And that came out again kind of at the plenum last week that Kurt was talking about. The problem is they're not ready to give the Hong Kongers the leeway to go do that. There were widespread reports earlier this summer that Carrie Lam was trying to make an offer to the protesters that involved investigations, amnesty, opening up a little bit the government, and was told at Beijing that she couldn't do that. So they put the Hong Kong leadership in a really tough place, which is looking to them to take care of the problems in Hong Kong, but not giving them the authority and the leeway to go do it.
I think part of the problem is, in fact, much of the problem is on the Chinese side. And I question whether we can say, Hong Kong government, you take care of it, you figure it out. I think the initiative should come from China. And I'm a dreamer, I'm an idealist, but I just sat down last night and I wrote a bunch of things. What could China do if they were willing to do it, to really reach out to Hong Kong? Could they use softer words? Could they suggest respect for Hong Kong? Could they talk about recognition that Hong Kong and China's histories, traditions, cultures are different? And let's talk about that. How do we bring harmony to them? Could they say something to the effect that, you know, to 22 years in, we've learned a lot about one country, two systems. Let's sit down and talk with different groups in Hong Kong, as well as in China perhaps, about what it really means. And can we make some adjustments in it? I wrote down public recognition, that Hong Kongers want some more control, or at least input, into who their political leaders are. That it, you know, all within the context of the Chinese nation, Chinese sovereignty. You know, they could announce that they're going to be much more careful about reaching into, you know, they wouldn't put it in these words, but reaching into Hong Kong government, into the police forces, trying to control everything. They could say that out loud. Be a tough thing for them perhaps, but those sorts of things I think would go a long way. They could also announce that they're withdrawing half of their military forces from Hong Kong. They don't need them all there. China's under no threat. I mean, that would be a very powerful signal. So it seems to me there are things that China could do if they did not just take the strong fist and say, you must do it our way. And as I said in my remarks, could they think about two adults sitting down to talk about problems and differences and begin in the same way that Deng Xiaoping did. He knew that flies would come in through the window, as he said, when they opened up economically. He knew there would be problems with the one country, two systems approach, but he was willing to give it a try. So am I optimistic under, Steve has very much described Xi Jinping in his controlling way and so on. Maybe it's a long shot, but I really think because China holds so much of the power, and it's in China's interest to keep things calm in Hong Kong and not to allow it to get out of control.
Okay, so
I have a couple of questions to ask, and also either to everyone or anyone wants to answer them. The first question I have here is that quite a few people mentioned the Hong Kong administration's problems in the last several decades. So a lot of problems have been accumulated. The current NAM administration has been one of the causes for the current protests. And how you personally worked with those chief executives from current one up to Tong in 1997. How do you think of their personal experiences, visions, or their incompetence or competence have contributed to the current accumulation of all those problems? I want to talk from personal experiences with these leaders in Hong Kong. The second question I have is that Kurt mentioned economic inequality, economic poverty, and anxiety, identity, all those problems. Among those problems, the Chinese side have accused Hong Kong, from many Chinese perspective, this is a typical capitalism. All those inequality, all those economic problems are caused by free economy. Hong Kong economy has been known as a really free capitalist economy. The Chinese model of a state-centric, state-led economic development has been successful from their perspective, avoided many problems we've seen in Hong Kong. And also, related question here is that the chaos from Chinese perspective, the violence have come to Hong Kong because of the free political expression, the free problems and freedom in Hong Kong. They justify their own policies that see all the problems, all the chaos in Hong Kong. So the Chinese government will say, see, we have a one-party system, we have dictatorship, works. So how do you respond to these problems and accusations from the Chinese side about Hong Kong's problems? The third question here is that you don't have to answer them all, but just throw them out. The protesters have 5 demands, and only one of them has been met, the withdrawal of extradition bill. The other 4 have been in the air. How do you think realistically these protesters could accomplish? And also their demands are reasonable or not reasonable? In that related issue here is that how do you characterize these protests, those people on the streets? The Chinese government has accused them as very violent gangsters or whatever, but millions of people have gone to the street. How do you characterize these people on the streets? So these are questions. You can pick them up or you can ask them all. Okay, so we'll start from Kurt again.
I worked with 2 chief executives, C.Y. Leung and Carrie Lam. C.Y. was in his lame duck phase when I was there, so I didn't have that much interaction with him. And he was quite close to the Beijing leadership and was very unpopular because he was the chief executive during that whole incident that I described around the failed political reform legislation and the umbrella movement. Carrie Lam was more hopeful when she came in because she's a thoughtful and talented administrator with 40-year history of running portions of the Hong Kong bureaucracy. But I found that in that position, she was being put under intense pressure from Beijing to deliver on political issues rather than, and in a way that people in Hong Kong didn't like, on those political issues, rather than doing what she wanted to do, which was address some of the economic problems of Hong Kong. The biggest economic problem of Hong Kong, in my opinion, is not sort of this excessive capitalist philosophy, but it's kind of a specific thing, but from a revenue sense, much of the government revenue comes from land sales. And that has allowed them to have a very low tax rate for the last many years. And that attracts business. So it's becomes a very pro-business, not pro-worker type economic policy environment. And has this unfortunate side effect of propping up land prices and encouraging concentration of wealth in property that has benefited tycoons, but not really benefited the people. And then some crucial mistakes were made, not well before I got there, it's their fault, for the Hong Kong government not to build enough public housing, which it goes back to the housing issue. Why don't I start there and let others talk about the 5 demands?
I'm just going to address the one that seems to me to be the most thorny, and that is the idea that the people of Hong Kong could actually freely elect their leader rather than having them squeezed through this committee that we've discussed of basically pro-Chinese people. It seems to me they would still have to get a leader who understood the reality of China's influence. But I don't see the system in Beijing ever allowing that, and so I think the tension's never going to go away. And I think that's sad, because I think it's one of those fundamental things. And if you look at Asia, which I studied for much of my professional career, the wave of democratization that has swept through so many other parts has been reasonably responsible and orderly, and I don't see why they're so afraid of it in Hong Kong, but I know the reason is that they're afraid of it in the mainland, and I think that's not going to change until there's something fundamental, and I hope that can transpire peacefully, but I think the tension in China will not change it as long as there is that authoritarian regime.
Should we change mics?
All right, I'm going to try to do quick answers to a couple of these. Capitalism, inequality, and violence. Hong Kong has always had inequality. It's always had the tycoons and the factory workers, the swimmers who came in from the mainland and got jobs, low-wage factories making textiles and consumer goods and stuff like that. When I was there was a rumor that the property magnates had a poker game every Tuesday night before the land auctions, and they fixed the prices. I could never quite figure out exactly where it was, and none of them would admit it to me. But there were certainly inequalities, and there was a lot of control. But remember, I mean, inequality on the mainland has soared in the last 40 years. You know, when we first started working in China in the 70s and the 80s, everybody was abysmally poor together, except for a few very high party cadre. Over time, there are billionaires in China, and there's still a lot of workers who migrate into the cities and try to get menial construction jobs. So yes, there is more inequality in Hong Kong, but you could say in some ways inequality has been a fact of life in Hong Kong for a long time, and inequality is soaring in the mainland, and there's resentments there too. On the Hong Kong executives, I worked right at the handover from British Governor Patton to Tong and knew a lot of the civil servants, not Carrie Lam a little bit, but not very much. I saw Chris Patton about 2 years later when he was working at the European Union. And I said, how's it going? He said, I'm trying to bring Hong Kong efficiency to the European Union. I said, it's not easy. He didn't succeed there. But Hong Kong always had the sort of most honest, best, most capable technocrats in the government, people who were incredibly, had great personal integrity, and an enormous degree of efficiency and capability. But they're politically tone deaf. They don't, they weren't trained under the British system, nor under the Chinese, to listen to the people and to figure out what people wanted. They knew the best thing for the people, and they just did it for them. And that only goes so far. At some point, you got to start listening to the people. And I'm afraid none of them, particularly the leaders that are there now, have shown any ability to do that. 5 demands, only one's been met. As I said, some of the ones that Carrie Lam wanted to meet, she was told she couldn't. The protesters just want to be listened to. They don't want to be part of the decision-making structure in Hong Kong. They want people to reach out and talk to them. And if you have this politically tone-deaf elite and people in the streets that want to be heard, you got to bridge that gap.
Great subjects and great questions. Thank you, Sam. One of my favorite subjects is that of governance. How do institutions and organizations govern themselves effectively? And then how do countries govern themselves effectively? 1.4 billion people in China. How do you govern them successfully? Can you do it top-down, pretty much the way Mao Zedong wanted to do, the way Xi Jinping is doing? I don't think you can do that over the longer term. But then the question is, how do you govern a semi-colony of Hong Kong? Hong Kong's been independent, well, under the British, more or less, for many, many years. And that's why I say I think China has got to be wise. It's got to be restrained. I don't think the 5 demands, even if somehow miraculously they were granted, would that really change and solve things? I don't think so. That's what people are believing today. But what you need is a new relationship, and I think a better relationship between China and Hong Kong, with people sitting down saying, where's the real problem? What are the problems? How can we find a way to govern Hong Kong well? The best Hong Kong governor in recent years was Chris Patten, because he knew how to govern. He knew how to be a leader. Now, you might not have liked him, the Chinese certainly did not like him, but he had governing experience. All of the chief executives since him, starting with C.H. Tong, have no real political governing experience. C.H. Tong, billionaire, owns a big shipping company, Boston Red Sox fan, lived in New England for many years, but he had no experience of how to run the government, the society. C.Y. Leung, similarly, he'd been running for years for a chief executive. So all of these people did their best, but they didn't have political governing experience. And I think that's what, and Carrie Lam is a senior Hong Kong civil servant. Honest, hardworking, everybody says, but she can't do anything without checking with her, basically her Chinese counterparts, masters, whatever you want to call them. And so that's why I think China needs to send the signal it is going to be restrained. We're going to give you room, we're going to give you scope to make decisions, to provide leadership, and we're not necessarily going to second guess you. We don't want you declaring independence, obviously, but we think that there are lots of ways that Hong Kong leaders can lead, and we can be okay with it as long as there is good open dialogue.
Okay.
Now we open the floor, and we have a microphone there. If you have questions, you want to line up in the microphone. We don't have much time left. Normally we'll end by now, but because we have this kind of opportunity from Consul General, so we extend to 2 hours event. So we end at 2 o'clock. When you ask question, identify yourself, very brief, don't make any statement, and ends with a question mark. Okay.
Gene Kinlan, not a formal student, merely an interested party. For two questions. One, how much does the theory of the bad apple impact in the barrel impact the Chinese leaders in Beijing? That's question one. In fear of the revolution, quote unquote, spreading. Secondly, no, answer that one. That's fine.
Let's take two questions together.
Answer that
the
one.
other person behind you.
Fine.
Yeah. In that way, we can save some time.
Okay, thank you. My name is David Chen. I'm a contract analyst. I was a student of Susan Shirk's at UCSD. My question is, maybe it dovetails on that, is for those that were there after their handover, shortly after the handover, the Richards, how did you guys deal with the discussion of democratic contagion? Did you reassure your Chinese counterparts? How did the Hong Kongers think of that idea, or did they? And did you have any sense of whether Shenzhen or Guangzhou or maybe the people in Taiwan had any sense of how democratic contagion could take over in the mainland? And then I think a lot of you have danced around the issue of, we have to put on our sinologist hats, 中南海 analysis, and see whether or not there can be a fundamental shift in the thinking in Xi Jinping or his inner circle about how to handle Hong Kong. Do you have any insights on how that can be done, or if it's being done?
Okay, so let's take answer these two questions, then we take the second round.
Can I try to start? These are basically the same question. What is is the bad apple, the bad example of Hong Kong, either demonstrators or democracy, going to infect the mainland, and is that why the mainland government is so concerned about it? And I think, right now it sort of works both ways. As we said during the course of our comments, there are certainly people on the mainland that say, hey, they get to demonstrate, they get to say their views, and they get to, and they want a right to vote. And, we've seen repeatedly in the mainland the sort of democracy spirit coming out. I mean, this goes back, in Chinese history to the May 4th movement, and, on through the century, every 10, 20 years, there's an outburst of democratic demands. Usually repressed by the governments, always repressed by the government so far. But there's something, in China that leads, that makes people want their own democracy. But the Communist Party also uses it the other way around, the democracy equals chaos propaganda. And that has a lot of weight to people. That has a lot of weight to people whose lives were, particularly the older people, I think, whose lives were really horrible under the Cultural Revolution and got a lot better the more openness there was, but just enough so that they had economic growth. And I think a lot of those people, sort of the 50 to 60-year-olds feel like democracy is chaos and we better watch out for it, whereas I think the younger people who grew up in a much more prosperous, much more successful China are much more prone to think that they deserve rights of choice too. What's the chance of a fundamental shift in this attitude from Zhongnanhai, from the center of Chinese power, the Central Politburo of the Communist Party? Nil? How's that? And I think, part of it is Xi Jinping himself, that he harkens back to his dad. He harkens back to the history of the Communist Party. He tells everybody you've got to be, red on the inside. He's trying to put party back into government, not just government at every level, but private industry, state corporations. And for most of us who've seen China open up and experiment in a lot of ways and do a lot of new things, he's going backwards. So I think as long as Xi Jinping's around, we don't expect to see him embracing openness as a tool of successful policy.
I'm ever so slightly hopeful that after after Xi Jinping steps down, whenever that is, that the pendulum in Chinese governance will once again move in the direction of openness and reform. Because there was, it's not enough swings of the pendulum to have established a pattern yet, but certainly there was a reaction in China to the Mao Zedong approach to governance, particularly hardcore communism that led to what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is essentially nationalistic, state-run capitalism. And I'm just hopeful that there may be a better future, and that for the people of China, as well as for, we haven't talked about U.S.-China relations or China's role in the global economy or the region or any of that thing. But these are all interrelated. For Hong Kong specifically, I think it's a question of how long they can hang on to what they have in hopes of a lighter touch from Beijing.
I just want to throw something out very briefly. As many of you know, and perhaps some of you in this room, I can't see because I'm blinded by the mountains, are in fact in that category. There have been hundreds of thousands of Chinese, very bright young Chinese coming to the United States to study. A lot of them stay on and become great American citizens. But I've always had this sense and hope, I guess it is, that some of them will go back and perhaps bring some of the experiences they had here, the openness both academically and in society, to China. But again, I get back to that fundamental question, not whether, but when the next eruption of a demand for a more open society will face the autocratic leaders of China.
Okay, so
Gordon Stuke, DU alumnus. One of you mentioned that you felt that young people in Hong Kong feared competition for jobs and stuff from people on the mainland, that they were more academically qualified or something. So I just raised it. I thought, well, are there inherent differences in the qualities of educational institutions in Hong Kong versus the mainland? And then a corollary to that, what is the freedom of movement that's allowed either direction, Hong Kong, mainland, and back, in terms of, even young people from Hong Kong maybe wanting to go to maybe supposedly better academic institutions on the mainland?
Okay, next.
The gentleman from New Hampshire introduced the idea that maybe Xi's power is not as steadfast as we usually think. And I was struck by that because I think in the mainstream depictions it's covered like Russia, where the figurehead is a metonym for the state, and any other kind of internal political factions are seen as subservient. So, I guess what are those depictions missing? What are Xi's weaknesses you see at the coming time when he would be changing power? And then, I guess to keep it relevant, would Hong Kong play any role in strengthening or exacerbating those weaknesses?
So I was the one that said that Hong Kong students are finding themselves less competitive vis-a-vis their counterparts on the mainland who are flooding in and getting jobs. And I think we ought to ask her to say whether I'm right or wrong.
You're right. The mechanics of it are this: there's a daily quota of immigrants from the mainland to Hong Kong, most of whom get that right to immigrate through marriage, and it's 150 a day. So over the course of 20 years, that has added about 1 million mainland people into Hong Kong. Not all of them are Mandarin speaking, but many of them bring different assumptions, different values, systems, and that's part of the milieu within Hong Kong. Aside from that, mainland students can study in Hong Kong. There's a quota, a limit on the number at the undergraduate level of 10% of the student body, but in graduate schools it gets quite high, 50, 60, 70% of the students in the graduate schools are from the mainland. It's not that mainland students are smarter, the educational system's better. Actually, the educational system's better in Hong Kong than it is in the mainland. But when you've got 1 billion people competing for scholarships and academic slots, then you're going to end up with a pretty good selection of talent, as opposed to everybody within a certain society. And so a lot of the nicest jobs, international banks, property developers, really high-paying stuff, lawyer, legal profession jobs and whatnot, you see a lot of mainland people coming in and taking those positions because they're very, very competitive.
A couple comments real quickly. One of the problems is language. You find many Hong Kongers, unfortunately, who are neither fluent in English or in Mandarin. That limits their employment prospects. When an American company hires somebody from Hong Kong who may be good otherwise, but who didn't speak good Mandarin or good English. So I think that is, and Hong Kong really has struggled with this question for many, many years. How do you teach good English? And how much Cantonese do you teach versus Mandarin? So the questions of language are at the heart of a lot of this. Also suspicions, and Kurt talked about milieu and so on. There are a lot of suspicions out there. You don't find a lot of Chinese companies that will hire an American to work inside their offices. Probably are often the same thing in Hong Kong, although Hong Kong's somewhat more open. Cantonese are somewhat more open, but there's a real inward lookingness when it comes to who you're willing to hire, who you're willing to trust, and so on. And all of these things feed into decisions which business people make, which individuals make, and so on.
So let me push this question a little bit harder before we let you ask that question, because here you talk about the disadvantage of local people in Hong Kong and also the mainland Chinese come to Hong Kong competing with their jobs. Here there's an issue Kurt mentioned earlier, identity issue. So it looks like here is, in addition to democracy, to economic equality, all those issues, the conflict here seems there's a very strong identity factor. That issue becomes much more difficult to get resolved. In fact, someone talking about the younger generation in China might be more open-minded toward democracy. What I saw has been just opposite. Those younger generation in mainland China has been much more nationalistic than the older generation. In fact, you can read mainland Chinese, the internet and social media responses to Hong Kong, very, very negative. Almost overwhelmingly anti-Hong Kong demonstrators, a lot of people. So they become identity conflict. The Hong Kong people thought they were disadvantaged by the mainland Chinese. Those Chinese managers in Hong Kong, they thought they were discriminated because they don't speak Cantonese. So this identity politics, how do you see a solution to that?
I wanted to get back to the question of Xi's power. I do think that he's certainly rivaling Deng Xiaoping, if not Mao Zedong, in terms of the titular power he has. He's the head of the military, he's the head of the party, he's the head of the state. So it's kind of that old thing, you break it, you own it. This man is the buck stopper for all the problems in China. So if problems arise and are recognized by the population, he will have a hard time dodging them. And I think there are a lot of problems in China because it's such an opaque system. It's hard to be sure, but the impression I have is that their income inequality is a growing problem. Pollution is a big problem, and these are issues that affect ordinary Chinese. There is a police state there. They have layer upon layer of control. But even those people might at some point buckle because they are in fact part of the population that suffers from these problems. And Xi Jinping has no backup. He's got all the power. So I think he's got a vulnerability there.
Quickly on the identity question, I think what the mainland would like to do is make people more happy to be Chinese inside Hong Kong. And their strategy for that has been, had several aspects. One is nationalistic education, which tends to backfire as part of a critical education curriculum, and teachers don't teach it sincerely, and so it doesn't work even when it's mandated. Another is to create opportunities for people to do business in the mainland and have more interactive experiences and travel there more often. That's been relatively effective among some parts of the Hong Kong population and kind of making them more positive about China. Another one that doesn't work is vilifying the West and kind of saying that you know, everyone outside China is bad. That doesn't fly in Hong Kong very well. And the last one is just do fun stuff. And for example, when the Olympics were held in Beijing, people in Hong Kong were quite excited that Chinese got a lot of medals. You know, it's like, wow, this is great. You know, they're beating all those other people, so that's cool. I'm kind of happy to be Chinese today. That doesn't have a lasting effect, but it's sometimes useful.
Yeah, Sam, can I answer your question directly? How do we solve the question of identity? We're wrestling with that in this country. But I would argue that in China, they have centuries of experience where local villages, customs, controls are number one. You pay obeisance to the emperor, yes, but the emperor is far away. And so linguistic bonding, cultural bonding, family bonding is extraordinarily important in China, much more so than I think most of us appreciate. Frankly, I don't see that going away anytime soon. Yes, the Communist Party is there, and they're telling people what to do and so on, and people up to a point will agree to do it, but they still trust their own family, their extended family, the people they know down the street, the Communist Party members who they think are on their side. So I don't think there are any easy answers. When I was in Shanghai for 3 years, 2013 to 16, there was a lot of talk about the Shanghai government trying to stamp out the use of Shanghainese in the schools. I don't know where that stands at this point, but it's part of that question of identity. No, you can't speak Shanghainese, you must speak Mandarin. And boy, I think most Chinese will continue to push back against that. So I think it's an ongoing, fascinating issue.
Okay, because of time, we just take all the questions, then you decide if you want to answer them or not, then we end. Okay, so go ahead.
So first of all, thank you all for coming here and speaking. It's really a privilege to be able to hear you all speak and hear all your expertise. My question is, to what extent does the CCP feel threatened by China's ongoing real estate bubble, and what effect does that have on China's approach to Hong Kong?
Hello, my name is Trey Riley, and I'm a master's student here. My question is related to it's been mentioned that China should take steps to try to resolve these issues in Hong Kong. My question is, if the narrative in mainland China is that democracy equals chaos, how much incentive do you guys believe is there for China to actually start to take steps to resolve some of these issues?
My name is Tom Dibney. I have two questions. One is an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about a demonstration in the last few days. And in the article, the journalist used the word re-education. Now, I don't know if that came from Beijing or if that was a journalist term. But anyway, I'd like to hear what you think about that situation. And the other is, Hong Kong used to be recognized as the financial window to Asia, and I believe it has moved over to Singapore. If that's the case, is Beijing aware of that, or do they even care?
Okay, who will pick up those questions?
I can do the wonky economic ones. Hong Kong has still got an edge on Singapore in a number of aspects of Asian financial markets, but has lost some share to Singapore in some other areas. And the flow from Hong Kong to Singapore has not been huge, but it's noticeable, and it's mostly come in the real economy rather than the financial economy. So Hong Kong still is the top financial center in Asia, and if it were to fall apart, then it would be kind of an open season between Singapore, Tokyo, but also New York and London about whether they would grab that market share. Because technologically, a lot of this stuff can be done. It doesn't have to happen on the ground now. But Hong Kong still has a place in doing business specifically with the mainland that some of these other places can't match. You mentioned the real estate bubble, gentlemen. I think, broadly speaking, China is concerned about financial stability, as is everybody, and so that creates a strong interest for the Chinese government to not see a financial instability in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is an important center for finance related to China. So that pushes in the direction of wanting to not have Hong Kong fall apart. In fact, one of the biggest costs for China, if the place just really went south, would be in the short-term financial stability area.
Work on your instincts. Yeah, the question about democracy and chaos, I'm not sure who gets credit for this, but there's the great statement, democracy is the worst system in the world, except for all the alternatives. I think we could agree on that for our own country as well as a lot of other places. But this idea that the Chinese, under Xi Jinping, under the Communist Party, will entertain not the slightest concession on allowing their people more of a say in things, I think continues to be a source of great instability. And just one other thing that, I woke up this morning and I didn't read the Wall Street Journal, but I looked at an article, I think it was in the New York Times, about these re-education camps in Xinjiang for the Uyghurs. Human rights abuses like that are just outrageous, and the scope of it, with maybe 1 million people in some form of detention in that area of the world, is just shocking to me. And what is also shocking is that the Muslim world won't say anything about it. So I think that there are a lot of vulnerable underbellies to China, and I think Xi Jinping lays awake at night worrying about all this, but his solution is the wrong one, which is to accumulate more power in his own hands. And I think that's, as I've said before, the key question about the future is how long that'll last.
On the re-education question, I think it's important to remember there's a long and horrible history of re-education through labor in modern China, and the anti-rightist campaign, the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, various administrative punishments over the last umpteen years. People sent to re-education camps, and now it's being done to the Uyghurs. So I can't imagine that they'd ever be in a position to do that in Hong Kong. I can imagine they'll try to spread a lot more propaganda about being Chinese and some of the things we've talked about. But the sort of putting people in camps and making them write confessions and work all day, if that ever happens, that's the end of Hong Kong anyway. The housing bubble in China, the Chinese government has done a fairly decent job of sort of kind of deflate it, or at least keep it from getting too big too fast again. And I think they've sort of got it under control. I worry more about the local government spending and the local government borrowing bubbles. And they've really tried to go after that problem in a half dozen different ways. Most recently, they're letting local governments float bonds. But there is a lot of shaky finance at local government levels. And that's ready for a crash if they can't fix it. So that's one I think. I watch that a little more closely than I watch the housing prices. The other final thing that kind of ties a bunch of these questions together is we haven't seen Chinese leaders manage their way through a downturn. We haven't seen it since Deng Xiaoping did the revival after Tiananmen Square. And the Chinese economy is slowing. Part of that's natural, part of that's global, part of that's domestic. Xi Jinping's taking control, putting state enterprises back in charge. That leads to a Chinese downturn. And it's not negative yet, but it's certainly slowed down. They say growth is 6%. I've never believed their numbers, so if you take 2 off of that, you're starting to get in ranges where they're not meeting people's expectations. So they may be in for some bumpy times inside China.
Speaking of bumpy times, 2 things I'd like to just have you continue to think about. One, building off what Richard said, they haven't had a real downturn. Go and read about the challenges that China faces. Yes, at one level we see them as this huge, enormous country about to roll over us and the rest of the world. China faces enormous problems, debt problems, ecological problems. So much of the water in the air is really poisoned. They're losing their glaciers and the water that comes from them. There are all kinds of problems with corruption still, despite what Xi Jinping has supposedly tried to do. Anyway, the list of challenges is enormous. The military challenge, which we are really worried about, I'll put this on the table. China has not been in military conflict since 1979 against Vietnam. Their troops, their leaders, have not managed a command and control system that they know is effective. So yes, we need to protect our own national security, but does Xi Jinping know for sure that all of his missiles and his planes and so on are going to work if push comes to shove? Hope to God we never come to a confrontation like that, but I think that would give him real pause. The other thing I want to say is about U.S.-China relations. We didn't really get into them, but I am quite worried about a dangerous downward spiral that we are on right now, a slippery slope. Read more about it. To have a successful foreign policy, you need a successful statecraft and diplomacy. You need to know where you want to be 10, 15, 20, 25 years out. Unfortunately, we do not really have such a plan. We don't have plans to get to some particular goals. We have built China up to be it's the next big thing that we have to struggle against. And yes, I have no brief for the Communist Party. I have no love for anything that they are doing to their own people. But we need to think, how do we build some bridges to China? How do we try to build some more constructive relationships? And there are all kinds of things that we can continue to do. So far, this administration has been mostly on the negative side as far as its comments about China. And I really worry that there's a developing sense in this country, China bad. We shouldn't have any students here, or we shouldn't do business with them. The idea of decoupling, I think, is just, there's good reason to protect our interests and to identify them, but we need to think about the longer term and how do we move toward a relationship that's good for everybody around the world. End of sermon.
Okay. I wanted to make one very brief comment about social instability within China that is sometimes overlooked. A lot of you remember that the One China policy was adopted to reduce the population of China about 30 years ago. Well, unfortunately...
Not One China policy, One Child policy.
One Child policy, yeah, sorry, One Child policy. And unfortunately, it occurred at about the same time that sonograms became very common in China. And with the traditional desire to have a male heir, long story short, there are too many young men looking for too few brides. And I remember riding in a car with a demographer once who said that is one of the most volatile unsettlers of society that you can face. And it's one that I don't think the Chinese have resolved. So that's yet another social problem with political implications.
Okay, so I think we have a very good conversation. But when all you said those problems, one problem came to my mind, the most serious problem is demographic. That's the most serious problem in China today because they'll get old before they get rich. That's a big problem. You said that there are a lot of young men looking for wives, which happens only in countryside. In the urban area, a lot of girls cannot find a husband. So that's a different issue there. I don't want to get into those kind of domestic issues, too complicated there. I was going to have another question, final question, but I don't think I have time to ask. I just threw that question to the audience here is that I was going to ask them as a US Consul Generals in Hong Kong, how do they think American policies taught Hong Kong from their personal experience? That was the last question I preserved. The last was going to ask them, and how do they think of Trump administration's policy taught current demonstrations in Hong Kong? That was my question, but I don't have time. I don't think you want to stay. You want to have it? Okay. Okay, so anyone want to answer those questions? Hong Kong, the US government, and personal.
I'm just going to jump into it. First, I think we need to be absolutely clear. I support administration speaking out. The president has kind of mumbled a few times. I think we need to be absolutely clear the importance of Hong Kong to us and to China and the world. I think that the Congress ought to pass the Hong Kong Democracy Act. It's going to drive the Chinese up the roof, but tough luck. We stand for something. I think the administration doesn't have a strategy, but then again, they don't have a strategy for Hong Kong, they don't have a strategy for China, they don't have a strategy for anything, so I shouldn't be surprised.
I'm going to defend the strategy a little bit, just because I was doing it recently. I mean, the idea that the U.S. should reinforce Hong Kong's autonomy, I think, is well understood within the administration. The problem has been implementation. My main complaints with the statements coming out of the administration recently is one, linking the Hong Kong issue to the trade talks, which I think just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And it shows that the trade talks are the highest priority for the United States, which is understandable, but linking them is not wise. And the other is, I don't think we've been sufficiently clear in differentiating between violent demonstrators and the broader population and their desires, because there's an organized adult demonstration movement going on in Hong Kong as well, and the violent demonstrations are quite small. The peaceful ones are quite large, and that shows where the Hong Kong people are. I think we need to be clear about reinforcing that notion.
I think we end here. I'm so grateful that you stay all the time. We have never had 2 hours event. I tried an 8-hour event within 1 hour. Today is a historical record. But I'm so grateful for the attendance and the patience to the event. Our next event on Thursday, the Consul General of South Korea from San Francisco. He will bring a scholar from South Korea, talk about the North Korean issue, talk about South Korean relationship with China, with Japan, and with Asian Pacific countries. We'll provide better food, for sure, to come. Okay, thank you, and thank you all for the contribution. Thank you all.